Welcome to the debate. Our source material today presents a really provocative analysis of modern relationships. It argues that, well, the search for genuine connection has often devolved into something quite different, a complex system marked by emotional strategy, psychological testing, and maybe disturbingly, the slow erosion of masculine identity.
Yeah, it's certainly an analysis that holds a mirror up to the difficulties many people clearly face in trying to form lasting, healthy partnerships. The material definitely highlights a profound crisis, doesn't it? Rooted deeply in these societal shifts around expectations and perceived power.
Exactly. And the central tension that really frames our discussion today is this balance, or maybe imbalance, between control and cooperation. So the core question we're taking from the material is this. Is the collapse of, let's say, true partnership in modern relationships primarily driven by one partner's active, culturally conditioned pursuit of emotional strategy and dominance, leading to specific psychological leverage? Or is this dynamic fundamentally a kind of tragedy of mutual cultural misunderstanding about vulnerability and cooperation? My position is that the material correctly identifies a distinct pattern of strategy and leverage, where actions, whether they're conscious or unconscious, really serve the purpose of calculated control, aimed ultimately at establishing dominance.
I come at it from a slightly different angle. While I absolutely acknowledge the presence and the damaging effects of that strategic behavior you mentioned, I maintain that the material's claims regarding the systemic cultural conditioning and the mutual confusion are actually the true engine of this relational decay. I see the dynamic described as primarily a tragedy of misalignment first, where both partners are kind of operating from faulty programming, rather than it being primarily a calculated campaign of individualized dominance by one person.
Okay, well, my position is really rooted in the structural analysis the material provides for how the relationship collapses. It claims modern coupling fundamentally is defined by a shift from connection to strategy. And this strategy, it argues, is often reinforced culturally, conditioning, let's say, the modern woman to view love as basically a game of control, which is then supported by media teaching analysis and manipulation of masculine energy. Crucially, that initial faith, that intoxicating illusion of understanding, it's presented not as genuine connection, but as the very mechanism for future collapse. When the man reveals his vulnerabilities, his weaknesses, he's essentially creating what the author terms a psychological blueprint. This isn't just closeness. This detailed knowledge is specifically used later for influence. And in this framework, vulnerability is explicitly treated as a tool, a weapon. The outcome, I think, proves the strategic intent. The man ends up sacrificing his authenticity just for the illusion of stability, leading directly to that central claim that a woman cannot love a man she controls simply because control strips away the very qualities needed for admiration.
Right. That's a very clear articulation of the dominance perspective, but I would frame the context quite differently. While the results, the man's self-erasure, his exhaustion, are undeniably real, the material itself frames both genders as, quote, victims of a cultural lie, a lie where love is competition, not cooperation. The root cause, therefore, isn't necessarily calculated malice on one side. It's a profound misunderstanding that fuels what the author calls chaos, mistaken for compatibility. And think about what this chaos means, practically. The man mistakes peace, just a temporary absence of conflict, for permission to retreat into silence. And the woman, well, she seeks dominance partly because the culture has trained her for leverage and seeking validation, not necessarily for genuine connection or relational confidence.
The tragedy here feels systemic to me. She loses the ability to admire a man who's actively self-erasing, and he loses the ability to lead himself, leaving her restless and him, well, numb. This collapse feels fueled by a broader societal failure to teach genuine partnership, not just, individualized strategic malice.
I see why you lean on that lens of systemic failure. But let's dig a bit deeper into that initial stage, that seductive beginning you mentioned. If this were purely mutual confusion, wouldn't the vulnerability exchanged,
the things shared in confidence, be treated with roughly equal care and respect by both sides when conflict eventually arose? But the material is very specific here. The charm, the intense mirroring, the empathy, it's described as the foundation of the eventual collapse precisely because it creates leverage. This psychological blueprint isn't just, oh, I know about his bad breakup. It's described as intense profiling that identifies his deepest insecurities. That's the mechanism by which future influence is exerted. Doesn't that strategic depth, which sort of anticipates future conflict and prepares a response based on that leverage, doesn't that suggest a deliberate strategic framework that goes beyond just accidental confusion?
I'm cautious about assigning, let's say, fully conscious malicious intent to that initial phase. Is it not possible for that initial, really intense connection, that feeling of being truly understood, maybe after prior emotional chaos, to genuinely exist? But because the modern culture fails to train either individual adequately in things like self-mastery and secure attachment, and instead maybe arms them with conflict strategies picked up from, I don't know, social media or pop psychology, couldn't the lack of maturity in both partners lead to the accidental weaponization of that vulnerability later on when they inevitably face pressure or stress? The material does state she is a product of social conditioning, which suggests the strategy might be a learned, reactive defense mechanism against perceived instability, rather than a primary premeditated intent to dominate right from the very first date. Maybe it's a tragedy of incompetence, rather than calculated design?
That's a powerful point about competence, or the lack of it. I grant you that. But even if the weaponization is reactive, the mechanism itself feels purely strategic. Let's pivot, though, to the man's agency in this dynamic, as you brought it up. The material makes a critical distinction, doesn't it? Love that demands you shrink is not love. It's possession wearing the perfume of affection. Now, this possession arises, as you noted, partly because the man's deep desire to avoid conflict leads him to silence himself. He sacrifices his boundaries, his opinions, creating a dynamic where, effectively, her emotional state becomes the sole law.
Right. I agree that the man enables the control, absolutely. By trying to manage the relationship like an emotional minefield, as the text says, sacrificing his authenticity just for that illusion of stability. So the control dynamic, yes, it's fundamentally co-created by his mistaken interpretation of peace as permission. He avoids asserting his own needs, and she, perhaps instinctively or perhaps strategically, fills that vacuum.
That's an interesting way to frame the man's compliance, yes. But I would argue that the man's very willingness to comply only validates and frankly accelerates the programmed pursuit of dominance that's been conditioned by the culture. I mean, why does he perceive the environment as a minefield in the first place? It's because the dynamic is perhaps unconsciously, but still strategically constructed to make his authentic self feel unsafe. Look at how conflict itself is described in the material. When he tries to bring logic to bear, it's dismissed as cold or intellectualizing. If he tries to stay calm, well, that's called detachment. When he finally, maybe after much provocation, asserts a boundary, it's immediately labeled control. This constant strategic reframing, it feels like a mechanism designed specifically to dismantle healthy masculinity by making any form of balanced self-assertion seem toxic or unacceptable.
The process strategically invalidates his every attempt at resolution, thereby forcing compliance. That feels like a textbook strategic maneuver to maintain leverage.
But okay, if it were strictly strategic, aimed purely at dominance, wouldn't we expect the lever pulling, the testing, to sort of cease once dominance is established? You know, if the man becomes fully compliant, theoretically the conflict should dissipate, shouldn't it? Yet the material brings up this chilling description of ongoing psychological warfare, where the man finds himself in a constant state of vigilance, interpreting every sigh, every silence, every veiled phrase as a potential test. This is described as leading to existential destruction and men mourning themselves while still alive. This level of emotional destruction, this is where the purely strategic argument hits a limit for me. You don't typically achieve that state of spiritual exhaustion and self-grieving simply through mutual confusion, I agree. But if the strategic aim was simply control, why would the conflict continue to the point of existential erasure? Wouldn't a stable, if unhealthy, equilibrium be the goal?
I'd argue that it is psychological warfare,
even if, as you say, it's waged by perhaps an unconscious cultural soldier. When the material talks about men mourning themselves while still alive, it's describing that slow, pervasive process where a man realizes he sacrificed his core values, his identity, his purpose, just for the mere avoidance of conflict. This constant emotional maintenance, this vigilance, it's the direct result of sustained strategic pressure exerted by a partner who might be seeking validation through dominance. The need for vigilance confirms the environment is aggressive and unstable. Achieving this level of internal erosion, I think, requires a consistent, strategic campaign of emotional leverage, designed to maintain control, perhaps regardless of the partner's conscious underlying intent. The mechanism of control, the constant testing, is the engine of that destruction. It doesn't stop because control itself requires constant reinforcement in this model.
I'm sorry, but I just don't quite buy that it's purely warfare in the sense of, calculated aggression intended for annihilation. If we accept the premise that the modern woman is not the enemy, she's a mirror of the culture that made her, then the exhaustion feels more like a symptom of a mutual system-wide failure, not focused malice. Think about the final tragedy of this cycle described. Eventually, she often leaves because he no longer projects the confidence that initially attracted her in the first place, right? She perhaps inadvertently successfully trained him to become compliant, but in doing so, she created the very man she ultimately desires to abandon. His silence, which was born of exhaustion, is then easily misunderstood as distance or indifference. This suggests a profound failure of expectations on both sides, fueled by cultural confusion about power dynamics rather than the ultimate success of a strategic dominance campaign. I mean, if the strategy was truly successful in its own terms, the relationship would stabilize under her control. Instead, it often collapses precisely because the essential element, respect perhaps, was destroyed in the process.
That paradox that she destroys what she desires is indeed the tragedy. I agree. But the destruction is arguably a consequence of the dominance strategy itself, not necessarily evidence that the strategy wasn't the driving force. The pursuit of control, as described here, inherently requires the dismantling of the partner's sovereignty.
And look at the material's proposed solution. It seems to speak directly to this mutual failure. The antidote is described as the man's rebirth of masculine purpose, setting clear emotional standards, proving his worth through his purpose, not just words. This solution, focusing on discipline and sovereignty over trying to achieve dominance himself, feels like an antidote to the general cultural confusion that perhaps trained men for approval-seeking, not leadership. It calls for the man to essentially fix his own internal programming, suggesting that the initial willingness to surrender that sovereignty, that mistake of trading self-mastery for temporary peace, is where the collapse truly begins. This implies the deepest problem might be the man's own confusion about his worth and role, which then allowed the strategy, whether conscious or not, to take root.
That's a compelling argument about the antidote focusing on the man's internal state. But I'd say the very necessity of that extreme solution, that level of detachment and self-focus, actually confirms the strategic aggressiveness of the environment he must defend against. When the material instructs the man to master detachment, with that critical line being, "I choose you, but I don't need you to choose me to stay whole," it's defining a boundary so absolute it can only serve as a direct defense mechanism. A defense against an environment predicated on emotional leverage and strategic withholding. The need to, quote, protect your mind and refuse to orbit around female validation is only necessary if that validation is being actively, strategically weaponized for control. The solution of sovereignty, of having boundaries that are described as architecture, not walls, feels like a fortress built precisely because the dynamic involves psychological warfare designed to breach his emotional independence. So, in summarizing my position, the evidence presented in the material strongly supports the view that strategic action, whether it's fully conscious or unconsciously derived from cultural conditioning, is the true engine of the relational decay being described. The process seems clearly defined by the weaponization of vulnerability, the calculated or instinctual pursuit of control, and the creation of that psychological blueprint for exerting influence. The material's primary message, then, feels like a call to refuse to be destroyed by this strategic programming
and to regain personal emotional sovereignty.
And summarizing my perspective, while strategy is undeniably present, often as a weapon used in conflict, I still believe the deeper tragedy is the systemic cultural context that makes both genders, in the material's words, victims of a cultural lie. The dynamic feels fundamentally sustained by mutual misunderstanding, that chaos mistaken for compatibility, and crucially, the man's initial willingness to trade his self-mastery for what turns out to be fleeting peace. The ultimate failure described is the collapse of true partnership, fueled more by systemic confusion about power and cooperation rather than just one-sided, calculated strategic control.
It's clear, I think, that fully understanding the source material really requires us to appreciate both elements, both the strategic mechanisms that are undoubtedly at play and the broader cultural confusion that seems to entrap both partners. The strategic moves might just be the observable manifestation of that deeper cultural failure.
Absolutely, and perhaps the material's ultimate value lies precisely there, in promoting awareness and self-mastery as a response to this complex modern tragedy, urging maybe both partners to abandon these culturally ingrained strategies in favor of striving for genuine, self-led connection.